he didn't like about the M10 was it used that volute suspension, which was really bouncy, and you lost speed because of the crews liked it, but he didn't like it for the speed. So we went to a torsion bar design. That's why you see wheels like this. They're attached to a bar that goes all the way through the tank, and has a wheel on the other side, and the bar flexes, and that gives it its suspension. Okay. The good thing about a torsion bar is you can make a very fast vehicle with it. It used a 76mm gun. It was an excellent gun. Same gun that was later put on the Sherman. But we also used what was called high-velocity armor-piercing ammunition with tungsten in it. It came out late in the war that could destroy any German tank. This was an excellent vehicle. It was very well made, very easy to maintain, and it was fast. It was the fastest armored vehicle up until the Abrams tank came out, ever made.
How fast?
42 miles an hour, which is pretty good for an armored vehicle. So it served very well. The last time these were used in combat was in Yugoslavia in the 1990s. The Yugoslavians had them. Well, when the Tiger and then the King Tiger and the Panther showed up, we started to realize, especially the Panther could not be defeated by the 3-inch gun at 1,000 meters to the front. It could kill on the side, but not to the front. So we needed a gun that could reach out and kill the German heavy tanks. So we put the 90mm anti-aircraft gun on a M10 chassis with a bigger turret, and came up with the 90mm gun motor carriage. It was commonly known as the Jackson, or the Slugger. And these came out near the end of the war, just before the Battle of the Bulge, put into service, and the crews loved this one, because it could kill any German tank out there. There were two types made. If you look here in the corner, because we needed a lot of them as fast as we could get them, we simply plopped the turret under the Sherman tank. This one was not as fast because it has all the heavy armor of the Sherman on it. That was the M36B1.
What kind of distance could they be accurate from or be effective from?
Let me get my cheat sheet.
Okay.
The M36, at 2,000 yards, it could still penetrate 105mm worth of armor. I could still defeat a German tank out at that range. Yeah, but the problem really isn't.
That's like a mile.
Is being able to see out that far and having the sights that could do it. 2,000 to 2,500 is about the battle limit in World War II because the sights, you're not going to see a tank. Nowadays, you can go out further. I mean, my Bradley could reach out and hit an enemy tank at 4,700 meters with a missile, and I could see it through the sights. If we detected it, we could kill it. But in World War II, you're not seeing it far. But to me, these were the important guys of the tank destroyer community. What's really interesting is the M8 armored car, which was made by Ford based on a 2.5-ton truck chassis. This was an excellent armored car. Still in use today. The Mexican Army still uses them. It had a 37mm. It started life as a proposed tank destroyer, and they rejected it because they didn't want a wheeled vehicle. They wanted a track one, but they turned around to the cavalry guys and says, "Hey, this is a great design. Turn it into an armored car, and we'll buy them because it'll be our reconnaissance." Every tank destroyer battalion had about 15 of these in their reconnaissance company. They also had the M20 utility car, which is the same chassis but without the turret. They had these in the tank destroyer companies for supporting their reconnaissance. They started out originally with the M3 Scout car, but because it was only a 4x4, it lacked the mobility that this guy had. These are the important ones. Why are these important? Because they're the ones that did the seek. And without the seek, you don't get to strike and destroy. They would go out, and this vehicle had such a good radio set for World War II, it could broadcast about 20 kilometers, which is pretty good in the 1940s. These guys are often the forgotten part of the whole tank destroyer and of the whole Army, because the Army had cavalry regiments full of these. it was 3 battalions of nothing but M8s. They were one of the units that slowed down the German northern advance during the Battle of the Bulge. It was a cavalry unit with nothing but those vehicles. There's even a case of this guy had only a 37 of killing a Panther as he waited for the Panther to go by. He shot it in the back, knocked it out. Great vehicles, made by Ford. Okay, so we've talked about theory. We've talked about the doctrine. Doctrine is theory, doctrine's a plan. What happens to a plan when it meets the enemy? Yeah, the enemy has a say in your plan, we used to say. I taught Command General Staff College, and we say, the enemy has a say in the success of your plan, okay? No plan survives contact with the enemy, okay? So what really happened? Well, remember the concept was, we're going to wait for this massive German armor to come, and then we're going to go find it, and then we're going to box it in, and we're going to shoot at it and kill it, right? Remember, we were going to do that. The Germans never did that to us, though. Because we were on the offensive. It was our massed armor going after them. There's only a few occasions where Germany actually massed armor against the United States. And by late night, after the Battle of the Bulge, we hardly fought any German tanks, because they were dead. They were blown up. So what happened was, because we were on the strategic offensive from 1943 on, and mostly on the operational offensive, the Germans were on the defensive. They weren't massing tanks except for certain counterattacks. So the opportunity to prove the doctrine by having this massive amount of enemy tanks breaking through our lines, and we're going to cut it off, never occurred. So we never really had to fight the way it was designed. As the war progressed, the German armor strength declined. As I said, it was knocked out. They lost. One of the real problems of the German tanks was by late 1944, all their experienced officers and NCOs were taking dirt naps. And they were no longer able to fight their tanks. So yeah, I said dirt naps. They were dead. And so their crews were new, they're inexperienced, and that played a big part in what was happening. So what did we end up having? An excess capacity. We had a capability that wasn't really being used the way it was designed. So a lot of general officers, including Patton, were going, you know, we spent a lot of money on this. We did all this. I would have rather had 4 more tank battalions than 4 tank destroyer battalions. That started coming up as early as 1943, believe it or not. Tank destroyers in action. This is a great picture. This is a picture of the reconnaissance company commander briefing one of his lieutenants just before the Battle of El Gutar, which is one of the shining moments of the tank destroyer command. It's a very famous picture.
Where is that?
El Gutar is Tunisia, which is the first action we're going to talk about. This is really, in my view, the only time in all of World War II where the tank destroyer doctrine got to be used the way it was designed. What happened was, this is after the Battle of Kasserine Pass. Remember Kasserine Pass, German counterattack, blood in our nose, didn't look very good. You see it in the movie Patton, you know, we look really bad, our guys are captured, overrun, killed, blah, blah, blah. Okay, well, after, and that happened somewhere up here in relationship to this battle. Afterwards, we counterattacked into the Germans. Well, the Germans have a doctrine. Whenever you can attack, you attack. So they countered our counterattack. And they sent the 10th Panzer Division to seize El Gutar. And one of the things they did to do that was they were going to come up the river valleys here, the little wadis, they're not really rivers because it's the desert, surround the infantry on the high ground, and then exploit and stop the American advance. Well, we saw them coming, so we sent 2 tank destroyer battalions in, the 601st and the 899th. The 601st had those little M3s, that was the Dodge truck with the 37s, and the M3s with the 75 millimeter, and the 899th had M10s. So what we did was we took the gun trucks and we put them on the high ground supporting the infantry, and then we hit them by a blocking force with the 899th. What this doesn't show is there was a reconnaissance screen. Remember all those armored cars? We had a reconnaissance screen that gradually fell back, and kept reporting the movements of the Germans so we could have the guns in place. And we walloped the Germans pretty bad here. Now, the M10s and the the M3s and the M6s didn't survive very well either because of the thin armor. And plus, the Germans went right into them. C Company was a M3 company, and it got hit directly when the Germans tried to take the infantry positions and got pretty much destroyed. But they claimed over 30 German tanks destroyed, including 2 Tigers. They stopped, pretty much destroyed the 10th Panzer Division's tank strength and wiped the division out. And it was done by the tank destroyers. And it was all because they were able to find them, they sought them out, they got into the right positions, and they killed them by long-range fires. It worked. The doctrine proved itself. It was never used again this way.
How many vehicles would be in each of those A, B, and C?
Let me see, 4 or 5 per platoon, 3 platoons, so 12 to 15 guns, plus about 6 reconnaissance vehicles. Okay, now we fast forward to 1944 after Normandy, and this is in the Mortain counteroffensive. If you can think of your Normandy geography, you remember it looks kind of like it's got a legs like a lamb that's been killed and its legs are sticking up in the air, and the back legs are sticking up towards Cherbourg. The Germans tried to cut off that peninsula, but with a counterattack. They tried to take the city of Mortain and cut off the American force to stop a breakout. And this was the Mortain counteroffensive. The reason why I picked this one, this was a M5 3-inch towed gun battalion. And what they did was, they came into the city of Mortain and set up in conjunction with the anti-tank company of the infantry regiment. So they massed their guns with the anti-tank company's guns. Now, these arrows don't mean anything. I found this thing, the arrows are pointing to pictures that this map accompanied, okay? That's where the pictures were taken. But the reason why I picked it was, and you can barely see it, you see the guns, there's guns here, guns back here, and what they're doing is they're facing all the avenues of approach that the Germans would take, and they mass the fires in it. Again, now this is a small version of what we saw at El Guitar. This is only a company or 2 of guns, but again, we massed them, and what happened was, in the early morning fog, the German Panzer Grenadiers, riding in their half-track, they come rolling down the road because they didn't think anybody was there. And we wiped them out because they ran into the 3-inch tank guns at less than 300 meters range. Smacked them hard. And they held off the German attack for 5 days with small force. So again, this showed the towed tank destroyer actually did work if it's in a position that can't be taken or hit by artillery, because the Germans didn't see them. They didn't think they were there. Even that big old gun, if you camouflage it and place it right. The 823rd lost 2 platoons of guns. They were overrun because once the Germans figured them out, they'd hit them with artillery, send the infantry up, outflank them, and wipe out the guns. And that's the problem with the towed guns. But it did show that a towed gun battalion could actually do its job. And the Bulge. The Battle of the Bulge is the next closest to the use of the doctrine as the way it was intended. The Germans tried to do a breakthrough. We all know the story of the Battle of the Bulge. Breakthrough with a couple with the 6th Panzer Army, and it didn't work. And the tank destroyers had a lot to do with this. The 644th was an M10 unit, and they fought Panthers, the best German tank out there. This tank crew was an ace. In one afternoon, killed 5 Panthers. I forget the name of the crew. I actually had it written down. I lost it. But they were an ace, killing 5 Panthers in an afternoon. And this was at Krinkel-Rokeroff. If you notice the bulge, remember the Germans broke through and it looked like a bulge, right? If you just think this is the map. And up here in the northern shoulder, we held that shoulder and held the Germans from getting to the city of Liège and using the highways that could have been the breakthrough. And part of that was in the town of Krinkel and Rokeroth. And I'd actually been there, I toured this. It's just a little sleepy, 2 villages in the middle of nowhere, Belgium. And it was such a vital road junction that the infantry fell back and we moved into 644th and they held out there with their M10s plus 1 company of M5s. So this was a battalion level massing of firepower which stopped the German tanks. So again, massing the firepower is the key to what tank destroyers were supposed to do. And it worked, but it didn't do it again on the big scale. That's kind of an interesting thing. The Battle of St. Vith, if we go back to that bulge, St. Vith was here. It was kind of like the northern Bastogne, where the Germans made the advance after surrounding part of the 106th Infantry Division, and they broke through, and we stopped them for a time, held them up at St. Vith. The tank destroyers were very key to this. And here's an interesting thing, the operational mobility. These units were fast. They could move a large distance in a quick amount of time. These guys were in Holland, all the way up in Holland when they get alerted, uh-oh, the Germans have broke through. You need to move down there and stop them. Not only that, they had half M10s and half M18s. They were converting. They were in the middle of training for converting. So they took what they got and they rolled into St. Vith and they maneuvered to destroy many Mark IVs, Panthers, and Tigers. And they slowed the advance to St. Vith. St. Vith was one of the vital points of the Battle of the Bulge. I'm sorry, they were converting to the M36, not the M18. And it proved, because there were some people, oh, we don't need this big gun with this big tank, and we don't need it. But it proved the value of it when they had to stop King Tigers, which they faced here. It showed the operational mobility of the tank destroyer battalion. And then down at Bastogne, there was 2 of them. They were another example. One was up on the Sauer River, and the other was in Aachen. They got the alert, and they moved all the way to Bastogne. And in time to get, one of them got in front of Bastogne with the task force, with Team Desabry. You read about it. Team Desabry was actually destroyed in front of Bastogne, but it was the key to slowing the Germans from taking the city, which allowed the 101st Airborne Division to get there. And then the 705th reinforced the 101st. You don't hear about these guys because the 101st goes, we won it, we did it all. Paratroopers, right? Without these guys and the 2 tank battalions they had with them, it might have been a different story. Notice that the 705th destroyed 39 German tanks and 3 half-tracks, and they only lost 5 of their M18s in this action. Again, it shows the operational mobility of the tank destroyer battalion, that it can move quickly, get in place, and meet the enemy. Now, I showed you 4 actions. There's many more. You could go to Tank Destroyer Net. They have a whole history. This is great. You can read all day, all the different battalions, all the cool things they've done. But a lot of what tank destroyers did was other roles. And this was in the manuals. The manuals actually told them, if you're not fighting tanks, this is what you will do. You will point your gun in the air and you'll fire as artillery. And they carried the sights and the stakes and the plotting boards to fire as artillery, and they were trained to. So these guys were very well trained. They were trained to fire as artillery. They were also used to support infantry by taking out bunkers at range. Now, what do you think an open-top vehicle in a city would be like? Fighting in a city. It's a good idea?
No.
Actually, it was. Believe it or not. In the city of Aachen, which we methodically had to fight through, the 26th Infantry took M10s, and what they did was they put them 2 blocks behind the infantry, so they weren't in direct contact with the enemy. They put the infantry out front. As the infantry crept down the streets and they came under fire, the infantry sergeant would raise his rifle with the bayonet pointing at where the enemy was. The M10 guys, because they had open turret, you could have 3 guys up with binoculars looking. They'd be looking, they'd see the guy, they'd look up where the window that he's pointing at, and they'd hammer it with 3-inch fire. End of German infantry. The American infantry goes in, cleans them up. It worked perfectly. They didn't lose a single M10 doing that. You don't drive it down where they can throw a grenade in. But in city streets can be long. So they did. They put them on the sidewalk and they crossfired. There was a great article in the 1980s in Armor magazine about that. So they were very effective at supporting infantry. Now, tank destroyers were organized as independent units that would be attached to the infantry and the armor. They actually had commands above them. There was 2 tank destroyer brigades, and there were, I think, 16 tank destroyer groups. I got to give colonels something to do. Guys like me to do the job, right? So the whole idea was that when they were training, that the tank destroyer group would be in charge of their training, their military justice, all those things that commanders have to do, and then he would parcel his units out as he see fit. Or, if the Germans massed, he would command the 3 tank destroyer battalions under his command to mass the fires. They never, ever were used that way. Most tank destroyer colonels did nothing through the whole war. So that was, and there was also tank groups too, that for the independent tank guys, the same concept. It didn't work, so they pretty much did away with those at the end of the war. There were a few instances where a smart corps division commander goes, hey, I got this colonel doing nothing, and made him a special task force to do this, gave him some tanks and some infantry, and it was another headquarters. But here was the great problem. Remember I talked about all these things, that when the U.S. Army has different branches, they had radios that talked at different frequencies than anybody else. That wasn't solved till the war was over. So there was a role for tank destroyers if they weren't fighting tanks. So much that in mid-1945, the Tank Destroyer Command did an extensive study on how tank destroyers could be used to fight Japanese bunkers and dug-in positions, and they were actually used in Okinawa that way. Basically, it became an assault gun and not a tank destroyer. All right, so we come to the end of the war. The war is over, we win, hooray. You know, America's triumphant along with the Russians and the Brits. And we sit back and we look, we go, you know, we spent all this money, we built all this big army, what worked and what didn't? We did this across all parts of the army. First, in December 1944, we came to the realization that the towed tank destroyer just wasn't cutting it, and they ended it. All towed tank destroyer units were then converted over to either M10 or M18 units. And then the European Theater of Operations, General Eisenhower's guys, they got a bunch of generals together and they did an assessment of the tank destroyers. This was also being done at a higher level, but this one really had a large impact. Bradley, Patton, Devers, they were all asked, what did you think? And they all said, they're good, but we really don't need them. And what it came down to was that you do need an armored, high-velocity gun to defeat other tanks. And it has to be self-propelled. You do need that. You have to have it. The idea of the tank destroyer doctrine really is a defensive doctrine. Give it to the armor branch and let the armor branch develop it. That's what the Infantry Center said way back in 1940. Remember I mentioned that. In 1940, we ended up going back to that solution in 1945. They said they recommended that artillery branch be responsible for deep organic anti-tank defense. That was not accepted by the U.S. Army. That tank destroyers as a separate force be discontinued. And the reason why is this. This is the M46 Pershing tank. It came out in late 1944, was fielded in 1945 in an experimental program here. Had a 90mm gun, highly mobile with torsion bar. It was a little under engine because it was using the same engine as a Sherman, but that would be later improved with the M46. Full turreted, it was a great tank, absolutely great tank for its time. There's a great famous picture of one movie of an M26 defeating a German Panther outside Cologne. It's the only footage of an American tank knocking out another tank where you can see both. It's great. Google it, it's awesome. So the realization was, you know what? Tanks can do this. We really don't need to have a separate, because when you have a separate command, you have a general, you have a staff, you have a base, that costs money. So they gave the mission to the armor branch that tanks will fight other tanks, and the Army moved towards the main battle tank concept by the late 1970s with the M60A3 tank and then the Abrams tank. but we were really doing it by the 50s and 60s anyhow. So they worked, but it might have been a luxury to have tank destroyers. So what did the tank destroyers do for the U.S. Army? Well, they did a lot. In a very short time, they developed the doctrine of fighting tanks at distance by long-range fire. We do that to this day. We call it support by fire. The concept of combined arms into action. Some people claim that the tank destroyer unit was the first true combined arms because they had reconnaissance assets and tank killing assets in the same thing. We actually fight that way to this day. When I was in the Army, my unit was attached to a tank battalion, my infantry unit. Always, I went with the same one all the time. I trained in an infantry unit, but I was attached to a tank unit. So we started learning how to cross-attach our arms to be effective. Combat in depth and maneuver warfare. This was the beginning of that kind of thinking, which persists to this day. In the 1970s, we did what was called active defense, and then in the 80s and 90s, what we called air-land battle. And these were battles of maneuver, not battles of static positions. And they come out of this tank destroyer doctrine, really. Aggressive spirit and training, the entire Army uses that. And a need for agility, mobility, and combat vehicle design. So the tank destroyers have a good legacy. And guess what? They destroyed tanks. I could not find the total number of tanks destroyed by tank destroyer units. But many of the histories, some of the best unit histories of World War II are the tank destroyer battalions. They kept great records, and they studied 39 tank destroyer battalions in that study that I mentioned. They averaged 34 enemy tanks destroyed each. That's pretty good. In the Third Army, Patton didn't like the tank destroyers. I guess he didn't realize what they did. They killed 686 tanks and 236 self-propelled guns, because the Germans used a lot of those at the end of the war instead of tanks. The highest battalion was at 823rd. They claimed 113 tanks destroyed. The 733rd says, we did too. So the tank destroyers did their job. They did what they set out to do, not just in the way that they were designed to do it. They still killed enemy tanks. So they worked. But there's more to this, okay? Did the need ever go away? Who remembers these guys? Anybody know who they are?
Russians.
Those are the Soviets in the 1960s. 1960, 1970, and 1980, we faced an invasion of Western Germany, a possible invasion of Western Germany by mass amounts of armor. The Russians had tanks and tanks and tanks, so many tanks and armored infantry fighting vehicles that Congress mandated in the late 1970s that every Army vehicle platform that is going to fight has to kill a tank, which is why my Bradley had 2 missiles on it, which made my crew have too much to do. But Congress said it had to, because there were so many, you did the math, everything had to kill a tank, and maybe we would still get it. So actually, this is where we were going to face that concept of a mass armored breakthrough and have to stop it. So we argued, again, how are we going to do it? What's really funny, in a small level, what was called the E companies. In infantry battalions, we had the M902 tank improved tow vehicle, which had missiles on it. It was an M113 with a hammerhead that came up and fired missiles. They had them in 3 platoons, and you would give each line company one. And they realized, wouldn't it be better if we massed fire and they put them all in one company and maneuvered them as a company? The problem was the vehicle was too slow, and by Desert Storm they didn't use them. They didn't even take them. They wouldn't keep up with the Abrams tank. But we had that same argument. In my mind, and this is not really my idea. This comes from a guy from the World of Tanks games. He does briefings for it. The guy's name is Major. He's a major in the Connecticut National Guard. His name is Moran. He mentioned that the attack aviation battalion actually became the tank destroyer battalion, but a very expensive one. And I'll show you why. Because what they did, their doctrine is exactly the same thing. They have scout helicopters that fly out, find the enemy, and then you fly into a kill position, mash your fires, and you fly away. It's the same exact doctrine, it's just done faster and it's done by flying. And the AH-64 helicopter can carry 18 missiles. That's almost 2 companies of Russian tanks. One helicopter. The problem is it's very expensive. Now you're doing the opposite. You're doing a $10 million platform to kill a $1 million tank. Okay? And they're very highly maintenance. But the U.S. Army continued to have tank destroyers. We didn't call them that, we called them anti-armor. This was a tow missile on an M113. This is a recoilless rifle on a Jeep. This is the M902 right here with the hammerhead and the tows. This is still in service, and this is still in service, and this is still in service. This is the Bradley. I worked on this program, came out in 2002. It's an infantry carrier, a wheeled infantry carrier with a similar hammerhead, fires the anti-tank missile on it. And now, I just read 2 days ago, all infantry carriers in the Stryker battalions, which is an infantry, will have a Javelin anti-tank missile on it. The need did not go away. These are my sources, my major sources. I read many more. What I recommend, if you want to read more about it, read The Tank Killers. This is an excellent book by Harry Yee. He goes through almost everything I say here, but in much more detail. A great book, easy read, and he goes into a lot of how tank destroyers were used throughout the war in World War II. I mentioned can openers. This talks about the development of the gun motor carriages. This book, which is really hard to find now, tells about the development of the M10 and M36, but it also reinforces what Yee says in the way the tank destroyer was developed. There's tank destroyer history, which is the actual history of the tank destroyer command at Fort Hood. That's excellent. You can get, there's some magazine articles like the Crunching Kitties. This was written out at Fort Leavenworth in the 1980s. He took the 1980s way of combat force development and applied it to whether tank destroyers were good. You can get the field manuals. All of these and this are available on tankdestroyer.net. That is an excellent site. This guy did all kinds of research. There's unit histories, there's photographs. You could spend a day reading. There's just a wealth of information on there. All these documents are available. That's how you can get all the manuals if you want to read the reconnaissance, how to do reconnaissance. That manual's there, all that stuff. So if you want to continue to read about tank destroyers, I say start here, read this book, and there's many more out there. I mean, this study here, even though it was in the 80s, is very good. So, and I put up, you know, the 823rd, the famous tank battalion. You can get their yearbook. At the end of the war, all these units had historical yearbooks published. I have my dad from 37th Infantry Division. This one is available online from Tank Destroyer Net. Tells everything that unit did in World War II. Excellent stuff.
Dare I ask what the crunching kitties mean?
Well, if you remember, in the very beginning, it shows a picture. The Tank Destroyer patch, Seek, Strike, Destroy, had the cougar bite the tank.
Okay.
That's the Crunching Kitty. They called themselves that.